Good day, everyone. My name is Mark Wu. I'm the director of the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the Critical Issues in China series. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Wang Hui, the Changjiang Professor of Chinese Literature at Tsinghua University, where he also directs the Tsinghua Institute for Advanced Studies. Professor Wang is also serving as the Dillsworth Fellow this year at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton. He will be speaking today on the topic of China from empire to nation state. And I think as some of you, or many of you may know, he's the author of a major treatise that was recently published by Harvard University Press entitled The Rise of Chinese Modern Thought. Joining him and moderating today's discussion will be Professor Peter Ball. Professor Ball does not need an introduction for most of you in this audience, but he is the Carswell Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilization, also the former Vice Provost for Advances in Learning, and as well as well known to many of you as the major driving force behind the China Biographical Database, which we are proud to house here at the Fairbank Center. So I will turn it over to Professor Ball to introduce our speaker further and to introduce today's topic. And I will also then turn it over to Professor Ball to moderate today's session. But please join me in providing a warm welcome to Professor Wang and to Professor Ball.
I'm not going to begin all over again, but and it's a work which actually goes back into history and looks into the present. And thanks in many ways to Harvard University Press and the editor there, Lindsay Waters, much of that book has now become available in English. And in fact, the introductory section of it has been translated and published by Harvard University Press as China from Empire to Nation State, which is his subject today. He's a prolific writer. He is politically active. He is a sponsor of lots of collaborations across the world pertaining to Chinese thought and intellectual history today, and we're delighted that he's here. He'll be speaking for anything up to around 40 minutes, 45 minutes. We'll then turn to questions and answers, and we'll be concluding, we expect, at around 1:15 today. Okay? So, Professor Wang.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I was asked to talk something here. And I know this series is critical issues that for China now. But my talk, it's, my book usually keeps certain distance. I try to engage in the contemporary issues. However, basically I try to keep certain distance for observing that for more historical perspective to understand what's going on now. So still, today's talk, it's still I try very hard yet last night to work on my PowerPoint and working on these. So the topic here, the China from empire to nation state, I intentionally add a question mark because actually I published a book on this title, but in the Italian version there was a question mark. In English version, there was no question mark here. That basically, because last years we know that a lot of discussions about empire, a lot of discussion in Chinese context about Tianxia and so on and so forth. Re-emergence of this category shows something that started from the reflection upon the nation state, but on the other hand, it's a question that the whole world structure, there was like Fred Cooper, they published a book on empire, not about the past, not only about past, but also about the contemporary structure, the world structure too. So in that sense, the from empire to nation state sounds more or less linear, the narrative to see that. So I try to ask this question again, how to understand this. And so, and what I try to see that is becoming Chinese multiple process, basically. The first talk is here. Most of the historians working on the modern China, there were asked the two questions. I think that I tried to summarize that into the two characteristics of Chinese history in the 20th century. The first is at the beginning of the century. That was the so-called continuity. Here should be question mark too, of empire and the nation state established in the revolutionary state building process at the beginning of the short 20th century. We know that in the early 20th century, the whole century underwent a radical process of revolution. However, the social structure and the political structure, and especially the population and the territory and so on and so forth, you can find to the great extent overlapped with the early dynasty. So that's why the people ask the question, so-called the dialectic relations between the rupture and the continuity. So the revolutions and the national moments and the disintegration of empires in 19th and the 20th century, it's a universal phenomenon in the world history. But how should we explain the continuity between the empire and the sovereign state? What's the relationship between the imperial building and the national building in Chinese history? That is one question. I will talk about this question later, explain too. But let's briefly touch upon the second one. It's also the controversial issue, the so-called continuity of revolution and the post-revolution at the end of the short 20th century. That you compare China with Soviet Union and most of the Eastern European socialist countries, that became very obvious. On the one hand, underwent a radical process of the marketization and the social transformation. But on the other hand, the political framework remained it's changed, but it still looks unchanged. So how to explain that the phenomena? The one is the beginning, another is ending. Because if you look at the Ottoman or Austro-Hungarian and so on and so forth, if you look at that, the fragmentation of empire happened in East Asia, then when we talk about China, we're a very different story. So in that sense, we raised the issue of continuity. I think they were legitimate, though this so-called continuity is not a natural process. It's through the radical revolution, and a lot of things happened from here. So, and also because of this, because when we talk about the continuity, a lot of people talk about the population and the composition of population. But China still, both in the Qing dynasty or in the modern China, was still the multi-ethnic society. And how to explain that, the long transformation? This is another question. We know that the recent years, a lot of the discussion and the debates on the Qing history, I think that is also one of the focus on that. So-called China as a pluralistic the whole, that was famously raised by the Fei Xiaotong, 多元一体. So it's a lot of discussion and a debate about the historiographical dualism of the so-called signification, Hanhua and Huhua, and the so-called Hunification, or so I don't know how to pronounce it. So, but the question I think here, in English, the concepts of Sinicization and the Hanification are hard to distinguish. In Chinese, it's very clear. The 中国话 and the Hanhua is different story, but in English, Sinicization and Hanification overlapped so much. That's why one of the reasons for the debates is the ambiguity of the translation itself. So I think it is when I work with my translator Marco here for the translation of that, we work hard how to translate it, because it's difficult for me to find a proper English concept to express that process, what we talk about the 中国话. So under the influence of modern European nationalistic theorizing, the Western notion of China has been marked with an ethno-nationalism. So that these ambiguous Chinese concepts, when translated into other languages, is easily equated with Hanification, so-called Sinicization. So I give the example here, the Zhongguohua in the modern China was the most popular issue raised by Mao in 1938. And he proposed making, we know that when we talk about the Zhongguohua, he said making Marxism concrete in China so that each of its manifestations carries the necessary Chinese characteristics, say Marxism in accordance with Chinese characteristics has become an urgent problem for the whole party. In other words, Mao's notion of Zhongguohua was directed at the Communist Party itself and the movement it promoted, which was nothing to do with Hanification at all. It's a much more political process. It's really for the transformation of political organization, how that can transform into Chinese context. Therefore, the transcending the conceptual framework of the ethno-nationalism and the redefining the concept of Sinicization is key to understanding China as a, what I called, my jargon, is a trans-systemic society. So-called systemic, what system, I think the language, linguistic system, ethnicity, people used to define it as a system is different from other religions, can be also the system, even the region, that the geographical is in the northwest or the southwest and the east and so on and so forth. But here it's as a country long involved and established. There was a long process. We can define it as a trans-systemic society. So the modern China has inherited the size and the demographic composition of the Qing dynasty, and the question of how to understand the modern China necessarily involves the question of how to understand the history of Qing dynasty, not only Qing dynasty, but a very long history, its early dynasties too, as well as its relation to the early dynasties. In contrast to other imperial histories, a question was asking about Chinese history is the following: why did the so-called conquering dynasties, this is also the question in a lot of debates on the term, the issue itself, established by the Mongols, Manchus, and others, eventually integrated themselves into Chinese dynastic history. That history itself shows that a certain kind of rupture happened in China, but eventually they were able to reconstruct the so-called continuity of the history. So the continuity is not something natural unfolding process, but the result of the different types of the reconstruction. So what role did the Confucian political culture play in the construction of the legitimacy of these new dynasties? What were the relations between Confucian political culture and other religions and cultures in this process of legitimacy construction? We ask about the role of Confucianism as a political culture, partly because if you compare China with other empires and also different kind of the transformation of different empires, it's that obviously Confucianism provides a certain kind of political culture, re-establish a new dynasty, insert itself into the chain of Chinese dynasties. So that was still, they identify them as a Chinese dynasties. So that's how to identify them, I will explain that. So that is how can we understand the continuity that Chinese history exhibits despite such a major historical twists and turns. So in the ongoing change of history, different dynasties constructed their legitimacy as Chinese dynasties in their own ways. It takes certain time, like a Qing dynasty from 17th to 18th century, that generally speaking, that it's so-called as a Chinese dynasty was broadly recognized. A process that cannot be expressed in a linear historical narrative. If the rise of Confucianism, and especially New Confucianism, entails a new reflection on historical rupture, what I talk about New Confucianism, like in the Song Dynasty, Song Confucianism, obviously in Han Yu's term is 文起八代之衰. That was also the long rupture of history. So they were able to reconstruct a certain kind of continuity. And our will to continue the tradition, then the continuity must be thought of in terms of rupture, in terms of a vision of historical initiative, politically speaking, in terms of a process of the continuous construction of legitimacy. China is intimately related to the thoughts and actions of people of a particular time. This category has demonstrated the unique flexibility, adaptability, and stability in multiple aspects, including its re-establishment of the legitimacy of dynasties ruled by the minority peoples, the reconstruction of equal relations between the different ethnic groups within dynasties, and the shaping of the tributary or diplomatic relations between the different political communities. So this process is akin to a living organism that continuously incorporates the new elements, including the foreign elements, into itself. Stability is mainly expressed in the ability to create the continuity in the Chinese civilization in the midst of the complex changing historical process. This is the basis for the enduring vitality of the trans-systemic society and the trans-civilizational civilization that is China. I think China, in the 19th century, especially after Mingji time, a lot of the Chinese also influenced by the Japanese scholars' idea about like a Confucian civilization or the Toyo civilization. Basically, that civilization was contrast to like a Christian, Islamic, and so on and so forth. But if you talk about the China only as a Confucian civilization, how to deal with the issue of like a Mongol, Tibetan, and so on and so forth, all the characteristic of Confucianism, Chinese characters, or the certain kind of the religious, both Confucianism and the Buddhism, or the Li Ling Zhi, that the legal code, and so on and so forth, in the different regions have the different traditions. In that sense, it's not only single civilization, but it's still as a whole. It's still, that's what I say, there's a trans-civilizational civilization, which also means that they are open to other societies too. Although the historical concepts of Hua, Xia, Han indicate an ethnic group, a civilization, a political community, their long and a complex series of changes ultimately coalesced within the modern development of China. In the contemporary context, it's preferable to use the Zhongguohua in place that in for me is a multiple process of becoming Chinese in place of a Hanification. There were 4 reasons for this. First, after their domination of the Central Plain, the northern peoples in different northern peoples sought to find their legitimacy in Chinese dynastic history while maintaining their own ethnic characteristics. Look at the Mongols in the Beiyuan and so on and so forth. And a lot of these identification with Chinese dynastic history was active and shouldn't be described as a Hanification or Sinicization, which often carries connotation of passivity. For example, the Jin, Yuan, and the Manchu rulers all constructed their legitimacy as Chinese dynasties through a series of ritual, legal, and institutional arrangements, as well as through the interpretations of Chinese classics. The Zhongguo, they constructed also underwent historical changes in the intention and the extension of the term. The concept of Zhongguohua is not a conceptual opposition of rupture and continuity, but rather a unification of the two into a conception of China that recognizes change and plurality. The second, I think that the reason for that, the process of becoming Chinese dynasties of them was neither a single process of integration nor a one-way process of conquest. It involved a complex relationship of recognition. Here I talk about the multiple recognitions. These relationships of recognition included both the recognition of dynastic legitimacy by the peoples of the Central Plain and its environs on the basis of everyday integration and the recognition of these dynasties, especially the Qing dynasty, as a Chinese dynasty, by the neighboring dynasties and the European states in tributary and diplomatic relations. At either level, recognition was not unidirectional. So the recognition of the Qing dynasty by Han Chinese and other ethnic groups was linked to their struggle for equality within the dynasty. For example, the Qing dynasty emperor argued that there was no distinction, no division between Han and so on and so forth. But in actual social political the relations, obviously you are very clear hierarchies there. So in that sense, there was certain kind of the local peoples from the Han people, they resisted that, they criticized in different ways. That struggle against that hierarchical relations could be expressed in a way, it reinforced the identity of China, because now we are thought as the same, we should be treated the same. So that was, which I define as a struggle for equality, distinct from modern egalitarianism, obviously not formally concept of equality. The recognition of the Qing dynasty as China by neighboring dynasties was accompanied by the Qing dynasty conscious effort to construct itself as a Chinese dynasty and assume the role of a Chinese dynasty in the world. A lot of scholars are already working on that, how the both in the ritual level, in the institutional level, and the social level, and how they try to do these. Regardless of the way the Qing dynasty referred to its entire territory as China or used the concept of China in diplomatic documents, the use of the term implies a so-called Sinicization, the process operating both internally and externally on two different levels and in two different directions. These processes conspicuously involved integration at each level, including the integration of geography, blood tie, customs, habits, language, culture, and politics, and it cannot be equated to merely Hanification or Hunification at all, because a lot of things really merged together and in different ways. So in that sense, not only the becoming Chinese, that the process of people, but also transform the connotation of China itself, because a lot of the culture or the political and the social elements were reorganized into that the social life and the political life. The three, the tension and the diversity. The Zhongguohua served as the basis for daily life through the intra-dynastic migration, intermarriage, changes in customs, corresponding institutional adjustments, and other social flows. In these changes and the integrations also included the elements of Islamization and the Buddhification and the Mongolification and Hanification, as well as the localization processes in different regions. And these processes, for example, Buddhification was a process learned from the other, transformed, but eventually were assimilated into the Chinese cultures. So in that sense, the not necessarily Islamicification or the Buddhistification were separated from the whole, but still in different period, in different regions, in the given circumstances that create the tensions and the struggles and so on and so forth. So, however, the process of dynasty building and the long-term socialization, these elements and the tendencies often intermingled and influenced each other in complex ways. The Zhongguohua eventually emerged as a dominant trend, becoming an intrinsic part of the flourishing Chinese civilization. In the world of everyday life, these elements are even more interconnected and fused, forming a transsystemic society. These processes do not include the tension and the struggle, conflicts, have never eliminated the diversity, and have never aimed to eliminate the diversity. From the perspective of dynastic evolution, openness and inclusiveness imply a process, political process. Look at how they made the different kind of the arrangements in Tibet, in the Xinjiang. You have the different social and Yunnan. So a civilization that recognizes diversity in religion, culture, and other identities is also necessarily political. So that's why we also need to think about not only, of course, the political nature of Confucianism, and also we also need to think about the interaction between the Confucianism and the Tibetan culture and other cultures, their exchange in that sense, the political way. So therefore, in addition to block time and the daily integration, asking what kind of institutions and the values can be used to establish a strong and flexible political community and ensure its continued growth and development are key questions in understanding China and its historical changes, regardless of the eras or different kind of the changes. So this is a third, the reason I think that the multiple process of the Zhongguohua. The fourth, the transsystemic society and the supra-societal system. Whether it is a multi-ethnic unified dynasty or a multi-ethnic unified state, China's unity cannot be equated with a monocultural political system. This is a transsystemic society, a trans-ethnic, trans-religious, trans-linguistic, and even trans-civilizational political community whose political unity is always based on the transsystemicity. Transsystemicity means that the one contains essential many, and the many are the organic content of the one. Therefore, not only the ethnic groups, religions are transsystemic, but each social body, including the village, family, and individual, to a certain extent, is transsystemic in the nature. So the transsystemic societies are always closely related to supra-societal systems and thus possess intrinsic openness. Because, for example, you have the long borders, of course, because it's arbitrary borders in a modern time. But a lot of the neighbors, relatives, the same ethnic groups, they're living in different countries, they still can continue as a certain kind of the community. In this sense, the concepts such as a transsystemic society and the supra-societal system provide a framework for understanding that is distinct from the concept of social groups based on any single identity. I think that these are obviously in the history and in reality, you found a lot of the contradictory facts. But I think there's a reminder of this is important because these either for the ordinary people and for the policy makers are all important to what kind of the policy and what kind of the social reality we are facing now. So this is the fourth reasons I think for explain this. And how to, these are the, basically I try to understand in the Chinese history because the early process, because in the historical there was a lot of the discussions about the continuity and the rupture. There was a belief that China was a kind of civilization more continuous and so on and so forth. But looking to the different episode of that, you find a lot of the ruptures. So for me is that what kind of a culture, what kind of political force can push the people reconstruct that the continuity for that. And what I talk about this long process. But anyway, after all, now we are facing the very different polities that was very different from traditional empire or the dynasties or the so on and so forth. That was how to explain the nation state and political centralization of course, in the context of China. The basic question here I list here and I try to answer these a little bit. First of all, it's again the binary of empire and the nation state, how to understand it. Some people say that now we are still living in the empire. Or some people now argue that we are living in the nation state world. And how to explain the overlaps between these two stereotypes. How did the Confucianism, for example, early, legitimize the Qing as a Chinese dynasty, and what kind of the identity legitimized the contemporary or the modern China? How were the pluralistic identities and the pluralistic political juristical institutions within the imperial system constructed? And in how that in the wake of colonialism and the nationalism, how was such imperial knowledge integrated into the new type of Confucian nationalism, the universalism and the nationalism, and so on. After all, my question is that in the late 19th century, especially the 20th century, the political centralization was based on a new concept, that is the so-called sovereignty. So a lot of people talk about the traditional, the ruling systems, for example, the emperor, different phases of emperors. But the sovereignty was the so-called the unified concept of that. It has really emerged how to deal with these kind of the issues. I try to explain these. I try to compare with the social theorists, their explanation about the political centralization. One obviously is Karl Marx. Karl Marx said that the bourgeois has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. From his perspective, the special revolution originates from the constantly revolutionizing the whole relations of society the capitalist production relies on. From this process, which centralized the means of production, there emerged a process of political centralization. You have the unified market. You need a unified government. So that's the political centralization happened. Like we can explain that how after the Opium War, gradually the powers, traditional pluralistic institutional arrangements became more and more centralized, whether or not it's true. So Marx said independent but loosely connected provinces with separate interests, laws, governments, and the systems of taxation became lumped together into one nation with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier, and one custom tariffs. So in that sense, how that the political centralization as a process was in contrast to like a diversity or the culture dimension of the traditions and so on and so forth. So this is his arguments. I try to explain the social theorist, the arguments for that political centralization. These are really, they contrast each other. He said that unlike Marx, who investigated the special revolution and the political centralization, a unified state, from the perspective of the capitalist reproduction, Carl Schmitt worked within a general outline of European history tracing the origins of the Special Revolution back to the context over colonizing and developing new territories during the 16th century's age of maritime exploration. As seen from Schmidt's perspective, the struggle between the European countries was therefore motivated not by the distinction between new and old imperialisms, as described by the Hobson and Lenin, but rather by that of Catholicism and Protestantism, which made way for a new kind of political subject to take the stage. It was precisely this struggle that, he said, neutralized the theological religious conflicts, making life secular and turning even the church into a state institution. So he, from the more or less religious, European religious background, to understand the so-called emergence of the nation state as a form of the political centralization. As a result, for him, for Europeans, this marked the start of an epoch of nations spanning the next 400 years of history and demarcating the modern world's whole scope and orientation. In this era, spanning from the 16th to the 20th centuries, the state governed all the conceptions of political order. On these conditions, the concrete historical unit of organization, which had formerly been pure, bound to its own epoch and delimited by history, lost its historical position and substantive features. In a build-wielding process of absorption, this form of state was transplanted to the various contexts belonging to fundamentally different epochs and peoples. It was hurled into the midst of altogether different outcomes and organizations. So that's two types of the explanation started from a European perspective to understand the politicization that was the result of the nation state and its systems. However, while the formation of a state as a cogent political body had not yet occurred in the 16th century Europe, China's own epoch of the state emerged more than 2,000 years ago, as early as in the Qin dynasty, in the warring state even. China's Confucian thinkers expressed the world order using the formulation, the authority of many states, 列国之士, transparent appear to the competitive political model of Zhou dynasty, especially the period of warring states, as a means for understanding the contemporaneous world situation, as well as distinguishing it from the principal system of dynastic unity that had been in place since the Qin and the Han. That repetition of the debates was also not completely new. We saw that in the Chinese long history is a continuous debate on the Fengjian and the Jingxian, that the centralized or decentralized political powers. That was also happened here, that give the certain kind of the singularity of the Chinese history here. And the formation of the rational bureaucratic system, Jingxian of the Qin dynasty, as well as its evolution as a state formation, constitutes a major chapter in China's history. In the cultural realm, this system integrated Confucianism and the legalism, and the political authority was intensely concentrated. Political forms submitted to a high level of bureaucratization. The integration of the system prefectures and the counties into the former feudal divisions impacted relations with regional communities. In terms of internal-external relations, the formidable opulence of the dynastic system provided the basic framework for large unified states. In order to accommodate the change and crisis, both foreign and domestic, modern China's revolution and the transformation couldn't but seek aid from all sorts of the foreign powers, forms, and value systems. But the historian here, the Professor Philip Kuhn, famously argued that the character of China's modern state has been shaped decisively by the flow of its internal history. Political activities of the 19th century were already dealing with the questions of the participation, competition, and the control in the context of condition inherited from 18th century and earlier. So in that sense, when we think about put these arguments into the context of the dialogue with Karl Marx and Carl Schmitt, then you immediately realize that maybe the things were very different in the Asian perspective to some extent here. And how to identify as a phenomenon of the sovereign state, that was Professor Philip Kuhn didn't directly talk about that when he studied the Wei. How do we explain these historical patterns that were both distinct from one another and yet bear resemblances in form, both form and function, identified today as a phenomenon of national sovereignty? First, this specific type of state system was constituted as a consequence of imperialist expansion. So merely pointing out that the state is a form of domination is not adequate. One must also point out the system's various transitional forms. Secondly, after having experienced a series of cultural revolutions, I mean not the Great Cultural Revolution, but started from the 20th century, around of that, people began using a sort of universal method to designate the various communities found throughout the history as ancient, medieval, and modern states, while polities like China and others were pejoratively termed empire, dynasties, tribes, and the tribal state, and so on and so forth. Of course, now suddenly, empire became another hot. It's totally different from early, because when before you use the term empire, immediately means that the authoritarian dictatorship, no possibility for democracy. But now that people talk about empire, they're talking about multicultural, multi-ethnic, and so on, so tolerance, and so on and so forth. So that was, the sovereign state was established by way of omitting differences from the course of history, or by suppressing various forms of historical time. So I here try to very briefly to talk about in different locations, because when you think about the Chinese multi-ethnic society, especially those society were living around the frontiers of China, so how can we think about these? So the first is two different kinds of the hunters. The first is inland. From the 17th century onward, Qing Dynasty came into the contact with Carl Schmitt, has termed two different kinds of hunters who participated in a vast expansion of space. The Treaty of Niaching concluded in 1689 between the Qing and the Russian governments clearly shows the accord reached between the sovereign states throughout the entirety of its content. So it's amazing that was in the 17th century. Why such a treaty between two empires shows the certain kind of characteristics, only the treaty between the sovereign states. That one of the reasons I think is those Jesuits from Portuguese and the French who brought the knowledge in Europe, and they are familiar with groceries and their knowledge is into that. They use that their technology, cartography and so on and so forth to define the borders and a certain kind of the others. So in the Qing Dynasty, you have the Anban, 驻藏大臣制度, all the Qing appointed imperial resident in Tibet, in Tibetan Office of Affairs and Mongolia, Tibetan Bureau of Affairs, the Tibetan autonomous regions. That was a long transformation from 17th century down to the 20th century. The evolution of systems in Xinjiang and Artikar, the Berg systems, bureaucratic system, province, the Xinjiang autonomous regions. You can see that from 17th century, gradually how that transformed. Later I will be back for the why such thing happened. The transformation in state of formation described above were distinct from the 19th century global conditions described by Marx. By no means was political centralization the consequence of having centralized the means of production, because at that time, those areas, no such capitalist development. So in that sense, the centralization, political centralization itself was the one aspect of the centralization of power within the process of the empire building, that the continuous empire building. So it's not only the nation state had these political centralization, even for old empire, still you have these kind of the political centralization there. Rather, so that's why the tendency to centralize the political power was the result of the complications in the geopolitical relations between peoples in the interior and imperial court. Like that the outside was between Russia and China, but also the Tibetan, Mongol, Xinjiang, and so on and so forth. That was an internal process there. And there was no effort during the early years of the Qing to attend the institutions of managing foreign affairs. Instead, responsibility for such matters was delegated to the Bureau of the Reception, one of the 4 courts within the Ministry of Rights. In accordance with the first article of 1858 Treaty of Tianjin demanding an envoy stationed in Beijing, in 1861, the Qing court finally acted under the pressure from Britain, France, and other major European powers to establish the Zhongliyamen, or the office in charge of affairs, or to assume the responsibility for the Ministry of Rights as well as Li Fanyuan. What special significance lies in the differences between the Northwestern and South European countries? In other words, differences in sovereign states and their standardized relations as they had been produced by struggles in sovereign relations in China and the East regions, because it was the Portuguese and the Spanish came to this region much earlier, but they didn't ask for, demand the unified institution to dealing with these kind of the issues. But only after that was mainly the Britain, Dutch, and they came, they organized for this. So here, the Schmidt said that here lies a case unique in its essence, its uniqueness. Comparability consists in the fact in England completed a elementary transformation in a wholly other historical moment and in a manner fully different from any other sea power. So that was the so-called the special revolution for him. The era of the India and the Pacific Oceans were all simultaneously transformed into the inland seas. Their institutional arrangements in this period were concerned with consolidating control over the distribution and the construction of authority over the continents, as well as their associated relations of interest. So here is a Portuguese in Macau, for example. I gave the example. There was no such kind of the demanding for that. It's really through the very cooperative way to have that, the part of that. So but after the 17th century, that was different. That was a new concept of the idea emerged from the 17th century. So that the Taiwan issue, Penghu Liedao, was very different from the early, the Macau's issue. And even afterwards in the 19th century, Macau and Hong Kong was still very different in different roles. Only after the Second Opium War, the Portuguese asked for that to transform the Macau into the former colony. So in that sense, both inside the different multiple factors had the impact for the centralization politically in different ways. But globally speaking, you have the new concept, the new knowledge, and the new roles together with the powers that enforce that, construct the new ideas. So it's how long time?
We should give time for questions soon.
2 minutes, okay. I will summarize that. The advent of the maritime authority signified the struggle between the two special orders. The fundamental aspects of this confrontation inevitably included how to standardize the allocation of land, methods of organizing the state. what kind of the techniques to use in delimiting the borders and the standards by which to define the relations between the community. In terms of the perspectives possible within the Europe from the start of Dutch efforts in the early 17th century to attack and occupy both Penghu Islands and Taiwan, these were in fact not only part of the burgeoning the compact between the northeastern European powers and Spain, but they were also a prelude to the successive global hegemony of 19th century Britain and the 20th century America. The revolutions in China and Russia, to some extent, you can at that time to relocate it into the confrontation between these two forces. So here I will not talk so much about these. I think that I will stop here.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So.
Something of his extraordinary breadth, both in historical knowledge and in knowledge of theory. The effort to bring together notions of rupture and continuity, of the multiplicity of ethnicities, and to formulate an idea of what he calls 中国化, which is different from traditions of sinification and or Hanhua, or Hanification, or whatever we're going to call this. And in listening to him discuss the four aspects that justify the use of this 中国化, this transformation into a China, I very often felt it ought to be true. It ought to be true. But to challenge him, and I think his ideas need to be thoroughly discussed and challenged, would take many more hours than he had to adumbrate them. But I would raise one or two things. One is, when we talk about Confucian, what do we mean? It's an open term in many ways, but you actually referred to two possibilities, which I think are important. One, going back to the Qin dynasty, and one is the two Confucian political visions, and one is of the justification for centralization, and the other is the justification for decentralization and the sort of so-called feudal Fengjian system. And it's good to keep in mind that although the centralized political system is associated initially with an anti-Confucian political order of the Qin, in fact, in its restoration during the Sui Tang period, it becomes totally seen as Confucian. And the debate then is from one camp of Confucians who favor a decentralized system with greater local leadership, and a centralizing group. And it's Liu Zhengyuan, after all, who writes the Fengjian Lun, the discussion of feudalism, which is a defense of that centralization. And so one way of thinking about this notion of 中国化 actually is to try to extend the notion of a centralized political system to all the peoples living in this territory we call the sovereign state of China, who have their own languages, their own political traditions, their own social systems, their own writing systems, and to say that for the first time in Chinese history, there will be one centralized administrative system that will include all the population. Because that is the true break with the past. The part of China that was included within the centralized political system was never the whole, right? But let us turn now to, I'm not going to give you a chance to respond to that. Rather, let's open this up to questions. We ask you to raise your hand till the mic reaches you, because this is being taped. And secondly, you must identify yourself. Thank you. So, open to questions. No questions, then I'll continue. No, please. Yes.
Please identify yourself.
Thank you, Professor Wang. I'm Peng Yi. I'm a first-year PhD student in Harvard Philosophy Department. So I know that you today said that you don't really interested in sort of contemporary issue, but like back in 20 years ago, you really sort of were in the front line of discussing contemporary issue then. So I've question for that. In your wonderful essay, 当代中国思想状况与现代性问题, or your general criticism of liberalism, you said that liberalism back then lost its sort of critical potential vis-a-vis the collusion of the state and market. But right now, do you see, given the political reality in China right now, the liberalism has, or in the process of regaining its critical potential?
Mm-hmm. I'm interested in the contemporary issues. I'm not. What I say that sometimes I try to keep certain distance in order to understand and interpret it. So even for the contemporary issues, I try, but sometimes it's more historical, sometimes it's more theoretical to engage that issue. Of course, I also engage in the direct issues too. You mentioned that it was long ago. That was in the early 90s, actually. That article was published, and after the publication triggered the debates. What I labeled was, at that time, the people labeled it as a debate between the New Left and the liberals. I have my definition, and I define it as a kind of the critique of the new liberalism rather than the liberalism. This is because it's in the late 90s, is a large scale, the layoff and the denationalization process. The huge corruption happened. Even now, still the impact of the institutional base can be traced back to that period. And also the belief of that the so-called marketization and the modernization can naturally resolve our questions. That's what I try to criticize that at that time. So it is not directly about the liberalism, especially in this context of the American version of all different. Of course, the liberalism is different versions too. For the contemporary, I think is a huge transformation already. My interpretation of that was the result of the reaction to the early overexpansion too. These are kind of the long process. Now, at that time, was over the only for the market ideology became very extreme fundamentalism. So in that case, caused a lot of the social problems already there. You have the social demanding for the intervention. That's what I can explain. Later, I wrote another piece, try to explain the process, and a little bit like the parallel process of Karl-Polanyi's great transformation. He described what happened in like World War I or afterwards in Europe at that time, why the centralization re-intervene into the process. What I argue that at that time, the most of people thought as a withdrawal of the state, it was a very strong state intervention itself. Otherwise, it's very difficult to interpret that kind of the large scale, the unemployment or the denationalization can happen. So that was I explained that. So this is a very different context now.
Okay, we have two questions over here. Yes. Please identify yourself.
Thank you. Aaron Glasserman. I'm a postdoc at the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies. Thank you for a really interesting talk. So I was struck in your discussion of 中国化, of Chinification, that in some ways it sounds very similar to certain things that people have said, Chinese thinkers and politicians, about ethnic blending or fusion, 民族融合. And so I noticed that you didn't talk about that, and so I'm wondering, how do you see your vision of 中国化, of Chinification, as relating to that, if at all? Thank you.
My interpretation of these mainly came from the early discussion on the Qing history, not about mainly it's not about the direct intervention in the current situation, but obviously these terms in Chinese, it's become very popular now. but in a very different ways. So I'm curious about that. When the first time I heard about the term of 中国化, when I was in Tibet in the field work, I thought that they're talking about like a Buddhism 中国化. How can you talk about the Buddhism? The Buddhism is the Chinese Buddhism. How can you think about that, especially if you use the sinicization immediately triggered the debates and the conflicts, because the people were sensitive to for that kind of the transform into the sinicization or like a Hanification. So that's why I reinterpret that, why the 中国化 is a multiple process in a different ways and transformed not only it's not only they identify the China, but also transformed the connotation of China itself, because you have a lot of the elements for that. But on the other hand, like in the Chinese history, you have the Hua, Han, and so on and so forth. Professor Chen Yuan is a very old senior generation historian. He talked about the Hua Hua, right? It's a lot of, he said that no, it's not Han Hua, but the Hua Hua. But the Hua Hua is mainly the culture issue. But 中国化 is still related to the institutional building process. So how can you, within that, the certain kind of the framework, to build up a kind of the tolerance of the multiple the cultures, let's say, within it? That was what I can say that Professor Bao's question, that what Gu Yanwu said, this is a tendency. Most of Confucianism argue for Fengjian rather than Junxian. Most of that, the people, but they debate each other. However, Gu Yanwu said that we need to put Fengjian into the framework of Junxian. Right? That's the how, in order to guarantee that the value of Fengjian, in that sense. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Wang. My name is Clark Hu. I'm a PhD student, candidate in politics from the Catholic University of America. So my question is, first, my impression of your lecture and also reading the English translation of your book actually is much more readable, I think, than your original Chinese text. So thank you for the translator. So first, under your narrative, so I was wondering if you are describing the utopia version of Chinese history or contemporary issue, or just the political reality or historical reality in Chinese history. When you talk about the peace, the process will become Chinese, you seems like describe it as a spontaneous process. It's a peaceful evolution, but in reality, it's by military conquest. It's by forcible indoctrination. It's by tight political control. Not only in Qing Dynasty, also in contemporary China. Mm-hmm. So, and you said Qing Empire is a very diverse, pluralistic whole, you use the facial tone concept. But some people maybe studying Qing history, they would say the reason why Qing Empire is diverse and pluralistic than the PRC, because it's a long Chinese empire. It's because this empire is ruling by the ethnic minority group. So they are rather to keep the political autonomy in Tibetan or Eastern Turkestan. But they tighten political control and use forcible political repression in the Han region. So that's my question. Thank you.
Okay. I think that, first of all, it's obviously, I tried to summarize that, some issues. And I will not reject that there was an intent, a certain kind of my ideas into it. But this really came from, because you need to analyze that. This, as I said, that this whole process is full of the tensions and the struggles too. But generally speaking, if you can, from the comparative perspective, to see that the different social societies, that are the different ways, that if you're talking about the political centralization, always it means the domination. It's always that there, but there was a different forms there. Even you find that after the transformation, that after the Qing Dynasty, in the early period, that like in the 1950s, 60s, you still established the autonomous region systems. Now the crisis and the conflicts follow up, that the system's in crisis too, that how to explain that. This is another question. But it also can see that history still matters there, even for the contemporary world. So in that sense, it can. This is a very different. I don't ask about that. Like a regional autonomy is really direct continuation of that the old history, but you look at the focus on the region and a certain kind of the continuity there, and how they need to consult these historical conditions to establish the system. That was, I think, the very real process. These are the issue, and also as for the later transformation is another story. We can talk about that too. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Wang. My name is Lang Chao. I'm a 6-year PhD student at the History and East Asian Languages program, and I work on the frontier history of late Imperial China. The question I have for you is that in your wonderful speech, you mostly just traced the political institutional changes and juxtapose those with those of the European nations and argue, I think, for a different understanding of how nation-state building process was for other cultures and empires. My question is, from an individual perspective, if we are to say someone is a Chinese, in your philosophy, what do you think is the true definition of being a Chinese person, and especially for those ethnic minority people?
You mean the individual figure, how they identify themselves as? That really depends on each person. That it's difficult. I couldn't give a unified answer to these questions. But basically, now living, of course, you have the political identity. For example, you're the Chinese citizen, or you're some other citizens living in China. But after all, we are really living in terms of what I labeled, that use that jargon, that the transsystemic. For me, like sometimes I need to a lot of the communication in other languages, right? Almost every day, you not only even you're living in China, you still need to do these kind of things, which means that you open to other sides of. You became the certain kind of member of other groups. So these are really always the very multiple issues. I raised this issue partly because of my own personal experience. When I was in like a Tibetan area, in Yunnan especially, because those border areas, the different ethnic groups living together, so one of my friends, his family is composed of the 4 ethnicities. It's one family, mother, father, himself, and his wife. Well, 4 ethnicities living together. It's a family. It's a family, but it's also they are member of ethnicity. Why I argue for this, because if you think about the single or one-dimensional identity itself, sometimes it's distorted the human being's identity, the richness of the identity itself. So that's why for individual, for community, for one country are the same. In that sense, are the same. So that's what I think that why the current idea of identity sometimes over-dimensional, either the ethnicity or the religious. That was dangerous to either easily to be lead to the clash and the conflicts. In the history, they were full of the clash and the conflicts. But we talk about also how that the conflicts happened, what kind of stimulate for that. At least these were when we ask about our own personal, individual identity, I think about these kind of the stories.
So this is an argument for Doyuan identity, right? Multiple identities. This will be our last question, I'm afraid.
My name is Benjamin Gallant. I'm an 8th year PhD student here. Thank you very much for the fascinating talk, Professor Wang. To kind of follow up on the last question, to what extent do you see trans-systemic societies as a framework for understanding non-Chinese societies? And to what extent is it only unique to China? Thank you.
These are, for me, these are the universal issue. It's not only specific for China. It's all the societies currently was really the trans-systemic. However, we bound to the idea of the single identity easily in a certain moment. So that's why the big problem. Then we can go back to the political centralization issue I mentioned, like Carl Schmitt. He talked about the Catholicism and the Protestantism. He traced back to that the roots of political centralization in the era of the so-called Maritime era was back to the single historical religious background itself, which means that for him, that the world order contained intrinsically between the different identities here. So it's really the Protestant and the Catholicism clash. And then you appear to the certain kind of uniform of the political state, the polities. So that's what I think. We need to rethink about the roots of the nationalism, this kind of the nationalism. This is really the way of political thinking. These are insights. I think that I learned from his insights, but we need to rethink that the roots of the contemporary conflicts can be traced back to different roots, but these at least one of that was these.
On that note, a call for rethinking. I think we'll stop and rethink ourselves. So, you know what I mean?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.